She had until the third day to keep the Pruitt boy breathing, and on the morning of the first, she stood in the doorway of the only physician's house in Sutter's Wells, Texas, and counted the grey membrane spreading across the back of a 6-year-old throat. And she did not let her face change, because in this town, her face was the one thing she could not afford to lose control of. It was the autumn of 1879. The boy's mother stood behind her in the narrow room, and the boy's mother was Cora Pruitt, who 11 months earlier had crossed the street rather than walk on the same plank sidewalk as the woman they called the Squaw-Woman. Naomi Vance held the tin reflector to catch the window light and looked into the small open mouth and saw what she had hoped, against everything she knew, not to see: a false skin. Pearl grey, leathery, knit across the tonsils and creeping toward the soft palate. The kind of thing that did not slough and did not bleed clean and did not answer to anything in Dr. Harlan's cabinet but time and a knife. "Well?" Cora Pruitt said. Her voice had the brittleness of a woman who has decided in advance to be insulted by the answer. "How long has he had the sore throat?" 2 days, 3. A pause. "He wouldn't eat the Sunday dinner. I thought he was being contrary." Naomi straightened. She was 31 years old that autumn, though the town would have guessed older, because the son of 6 summers she did not talk about had set lines into her that a Philadelphia woman of her years did not have. She wore a plain grey work dress, the cuffs turned back, and her dark hair pulled into a knot so severe it might have been an apology, and her hands on the reflector were a rider's hands, scarred across the knuckles, the wrong hands for a Philadelphia parlor and the wrong hands for a frontier kitchen both. On a cord beneath her collar, where no one could see it, hung a small gold ring that had not been on her finger in 8 years. She wore the ring the way some people carry a stone in a pocket, to remember the weight of a thing. "Where is Dr. Harlan?" Cora asked. "At the Kessler place, the grandfather's heart." Naomi set down the reflector. "He left at dawn. It is 14 miles. "Then we wait for him." "We do not wait for him." She said it quietly, and she said it without looking up, which was a habit she had learned in a place she did not name, that you could say a hard thing to a frightened person if you took the weight out of your eyes while you said it. "Mrs. Pruitt, your son has the diphtheria. You know the word." The woman knew the word. Everyone in a frontier town knew the word, the way they knew the word fire. Cora Pruitt's hand went to her own throat, an old animal gesture, and for one moment the contempt went out of her face and left only the thing underneath, which was the same thing that was under every face in Sutter's Wells when that word was said aloud, and it made them, briefly, all the same. I have read the Sutter's Wells physician's daybook for that autumn. Dr. Harlan kept it in a clerk's hand, careful, and the entries for the last week of October run together into a single long sentence of names and hours, and there is a line, undated, squeezed into the margin in a different ink. A smaller, faster hand, a woman's hand, that says only, "Membrane forming, both Pruitt children, no calomel left, sent Reese for the lime." I have held that page. The lime mattered. I will come to why. The thing the town did not know about Naomi Vance, and the thing she had spent 11 months in Sutter's Wells making sure they would not learn, was that she had sat for 1 year in the lecture hall of the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Most still called it the Female Medical College, the older name it had carried until the year before she came up, and the old name was the one on the lintel and in everyone's mouth. In the winter of 1868, in a room of women being taught anatomy by men who had agreed to teach them only on the careful conditions of the day, the women's instruction kept separate and private, screened off, as the women of that first generation always were, from the male students down the hall, and that she had left that room in the spring not because she failed the examinations, she did not fail them, but because of a thing that happened to her family in the April of that year, which she also did not talk about, and which had set her on the road that ended, by a route no one would have predicted, in a Comanche winter camp on the Llano Estacado. That was the first turn of it. The town had decided what she was from the outside in. The truth ran the other way. "You will boil water," Naomi told Cora Pruitt. "All of it you have, and you will send for your husband and for anyone in this house under 12 years, and you will keep them out of this room, because what he has they can take. Where is the girl?" "Sally, she's 7. She's at the Hendrys." "Bring her home and look in her throat in the good light, and if you see what is in his, you come to me before you do one other thing. Not the preacher, not your sister, me." Naomi paused. "I know what you think of me. Think it on your own time. Right now, I am the only person within 14 miles who has watched this disease take a child and lose, and I would rather you hated me and did as I said than liked me and buried both your children by Friday." Cora Pruitt stared at her. The clock on Harlan's mantel, a cheap 8-day movement that ran 4 minutes fast, knocked through the silence. "Both," she said. "It travels in a house like fire in a hay barn. You asked me how long. The answer is, faster than your husband can ride to fetch the doctor and back." The woman went to boil the water. The man the margin note called Reese had brought Naomi to the practice of medicine in Sutter's Wells the way a current brings a thing to a particular bank, without intending to, by simply being where she washed up. His name was Eli Reese, and he was perhaps 40, a lean and unhurried man who had scouted for the 4th Cavalry out of Fort Concho in the years of the river campaigns, and who had quit it, the town understood, over something he would not discuss, which suited the town because there were a number of things Eli Reese would not discuss, and the town had stopped trying. He broke horses for the bar cross and for anyone else who paid, and he was the only man in Sutter's Wells who, on the day Naomi Vance had stepped off the freight wagon with one carpet bag and a face that gave away nothing, had looked at her hands. She had noticed him notice. That was the thing. She had spent 6 winters in a world where noticing who watched your hands was the difference between living and not, and when the lean man by the livery had let his eyes go to her hands and then, very deliberately, away, she had understood that he had read something in them, and that he had chosen, for reasons of his own, to put it down and not pick it up. Her hands were the wrong hands for a Philadelphia lady, and the wrong hands for a frontier housewife both. They were a worker's hands, scarred across the knuckles, a white seam down the left thumb where a skinning knife had once gone where it should not. But under the work was something else, a precision, a way the fingers found the exact place on a horse's fetlock or a child's wrist that did not come from work alone. Eli Reese had seen Apache scouts with hands that knew where to press. He had seen one army contract surgeon, a Scotsman, with hands like that. He had never expected to see them on a woman climbing down from the Abilene freight in a grey dress, and he had said nothing, and that nothing was the beginning. The morning Cora Pruitt's boy took sick, Reese was at the livery corral, working a green 3-year-old on a long line, and Naomi sent the Pruitts' hired boy running with 2 words. "Lime, hurry." And Reese left the colt standing in the ring with its line dragging, which a man does not do unless the 2 words have weight, and he went to the mercantile and bought every sack of quicklime Aldous Pruvis had, which was 3, and he carried them himself to Harlan's house at a pace that made the town look up. This is where I should say what the lime was for, because the town did not know either, and it is the kind of thing that tells you everything about the difference between Naomi Vance and the men who had let her sweep their sidewalks. Diphtheria does not kill the way the town thought it did. The town thought of fever, of a child burning down like a lamp running out of oil, and there was fever, but the fever was not the killer. The killer was the membrane, the false grey skin growing across the throat, and what it did was simpler and worse than fever. It closed the road air took to the lungs. A child with diphtheria in the autumn of 1879, in a town without the antitoxin that would not exist for another 15 years, did not burn out. He suffocated, slowly, awake, with his mother holding him, over hours, while the grey skin grew. And the lime was for the floor, and the rags, and the spit bowl, and everything the child's breath touched, because Naomi Vance had learned, in a lecture hall behind a curtain in Philadelphia, a thing that most frontier doctors had not yet fully believed, which was that the disease was a living thing that passed from breath to breath, and that you fought it not only at the throat of the child who had it, but at the threshold of every other child who did not yet. She had also learned a thing the lecture hall had not taught her, and that the Comanche woman, who had been something between a captor and a teacher to her, in the years she did not speak of, had taught her without words, by doing it in front of her, in a smoke-dark lodge over a child of the band. That there was a moment when the throat closed past a certain point, when a knife was not the worst thing you could do. It was the only thing. She had watched that woman do it. She had held the child's head. She had not herself ever done it. By noon, the boy, whose name was Tom Pruitt, and who was 6, had spent the better part of an hour fighting for each breath, and the sound he made, the town would remember the sound, the ones who heard it through the wall, was a high, tearing, sucking note, like wind in a bad flu. Naomi had him propped upright in Dr. Harlan's examining chair, because lying down was drowning him. She had swabbed the throat with what Harlan had, which was a brush and a tincture that did nothing the membrane respected. She had Cora holding a kettle of steaming water with a sheet tented over it, and the boy's head, because the steam bought minutes, and minutes were the only currency she had. The preacher came at 1 o'clock. His name was the Reverend Absalom Teague, and he was a tall, soft-handed man who had buried a great many people in Sutter's Wells, and who had concluded, as men in his position sometimes do, that burying was the larger part of the work, and curing a kind of vanity. He came because Cora's sister had run to fetch him, and he came into the sick room without being asked, and he looked at the boy and at the woman bent over the boy, and the first thing he said, in the voice he used for graves, was, "Should that woman's hands be on a Christian child?" Naomi did not turn around. "There is steam to keep up," she said. "If you have not had the diphtheria yourself, Reverend, you will stand in the yard. If you have had it and lived, you may make yourself useful by holding the kettle, and we will discuss my hands at the boy's christening, which I intend him to have." "Mrs. Pruitt," the Reverend said, "I would not leave my son to—" "Reverend!" It was Cora. She had not moved from the kettle. Her knuckles on the handle were white, and her face was the face of a woman who has crossed some last interior line and come out the other side into a place where the opinions of her sister and her preacher are very small and very far away. "Get out of my house." I have wondered, reading the daybook, what it cost her to say it, that woman who had crossed a street to avoid this same pair of hands. I think it cost her a great deal, and I think she would have paid it twice. There is a thing that happens to people at the edge of losing a child, where the whole architecture of who is respectable and who is not, which had seemed to be the bones of the world, turns out to have been a paper screen and falls. The Reverend Teague went out to the yard. He did not go home. He stood at the gate, where, by mid-afternoon, a number of other people from Sutter's Wells had also come to stand, because the high, tearing sound carried, and a town that had a name for Naomi Vance was about to spend 3 days learning that the name had been a luxury they could no longer afford. "He's going blue," Cora said. Her voice did not rise. It had gone past rising. Naomi looked. The boy's lips had the color she had been watching the edges of his fingernails to anticipate. The deep slate, that is the body running out of the thing it cannot store. She had perhaps an hour before the steam stopped buying minutes. She thought of the smoke-dark lodge and the woman's hands and the small horn-handled blade and the child of the band who had lived, and the second child, the next winter, who had not, because they had come to it too late. She sent the hired boy for Eli Reese, who could hold a head still, and she went to Dr. Harlan's instrument case, and she took out the smallest scalpel and a length of the silver tracheotomy tube that every contract surgeon's case carried in those years, and that almost no one in a town this size had ever seen used. And she laid them in a dish of carbolic, and her hands, the town would later swear, did not shake, which was not the same as her not being afraid. Reese came through the door at a near run and stopped when he saw the dish. "You done this?" he said. Not quite a question. "I have seen it done. Once that lived, once that didn't." He looked at the boy and at the blade and at her, and a thing passed over his face that she had not seen on the face of any man in Sutter's Wells, which was that he was not weighing whether a woman should, but only whether this woman could. And having weighed it, he set his hat on Harlan's desk and rolled his sleeves and said, "Tell me how you want him held." Through the window, in the yard, the Reverend Teague and 11 citizens of Sutter's Wells watched a woman they had decided they knew bend over a dying child with a knife, and not one of them, in that moment, could have told you her name, because the name they had given her had finally become too small to hold what they were looking at, and the name she had been born with they had never been permitted to know. She set the edge of the blade against the boy's throat, below the closing road, at the soft place between the rings of cartilage where the woman in the lodge had set hers, and she breathed once, the way she had been taught in 2 countries to breathe before a thing that could not be taken back. The boy breathed. That was the first thing in the long quiet that came after, and it was a strange, small sound to have cost so much. A thin whistle of air through a silver tube no longer than a man's finger, going in and out of a throat that an hour before had been closing like a fist. Naomi had her hand flat on the boy's chest, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel the rise and fall and be sure of it, the way you press your hand to a banked fire to be sure of the coals. Eli Reese still knelt with the boy's head braced in the cradle of his forearm, and he did not move it, even now, even after she said, low, "You can let him down easy," because he had been a man who held still under fire, and he understood that the holding still was not over. Cora Pruitt had stopped making any sound at all. She stood by the cold kettle, with both hands pressed flat over her mouth, and the steam damp had plastered the hair to her temples, and she was watching her son's chest go up and down, and the tears were running, and she was not wiping them. Outside the window, the yard had gone silent. The Reverend Teague and the 11 citizens of Sutter's Wells had heard the tearing sound stop, and had not known, for a long moment, whether it had stopped because the woman had saved the boy, or because the boy was dead. And the silence in the yard was the silence of people afraid to learn which. It was Reese who went to the window finally, and opened it a hand's width, and said, in the flat, carrying voice of a man used to giving range, "He's breathing. Go on home. There's nothing to see, and there's plenty to catch." They went, slowly, the way a crowd goes when it has come for one ending and been handed another, and does not yet know how to feel about it. The Reverend Teague stood a moment longer at the gate, and Naomi, glancing up from the boy, met his eyes through the glass, and neither of them said anything, and he turned and went too. She did not feel triumph. She wanted the town to understand that, the part of the town that later told the story as though she had wanted to show them. She felt the particular emptiness that comes after a thing that might have gone the other way. The emptiness she had felt the second time, in the lodge, the winter the child had not lived, when she had been the one holding the head, and the woman had laid down the horn-handled blade and looked at her hands a long time, and then covered the child's face. There is no triumph in the trade. There is only the next breath, and the next, and the work of keeping them coming. "He'll need watching all the night," she said to Cora. "The tube clogs. When it does, he will sound like he's drowning again, and you will clear it with this." She showed her the slim feather she had cut and curved. "The way you'd clean a lampwick, gentle, all the way through. And then you will be the most frightened you have ever been for about 10 seconds, and then he will breathe. I'll teach you before dark. You can do it. You have to, because I cannot be in this house and the others both." "The others?" "There'll be others, Mrs. Pruitt. There always are." She was already at the basin, scrubbing to the elbow with the grey soap and the lime water that stung the cracks in her knuckles. "I'd thank God it started in a house where the mother doesn't faint." Cora Pruitt made a sound that was almost a laugh, the broken kind, and said, "You don't know me. You don't know what I'd faint at." "No," Naomi agreed. "I don't know you. You crossed the street from me for the better part of a year." She said it without heat, drying her hands. "And just now you put your boy's life in those hands you wouldn't walk beside. So I'd say neither of us knows the other as well as we thought we did, and that's a thing we can take up later, after." She left to see the Hendry children where Sally Pruitt had been sent, and to look in their throats by the good light, because the disease did not respect a quarantine you put up late. Reese walked with her. He carried the lime. He did not offer to, and she did not ask. He simply lifted the sack to his shoulder when she picked up her bag, and they went down the dusk blue street of Sutter's Wells together, the ex-scout and the Squaw-Woman, and a curtain moved in the Aldous Pruvis house as they passed, and neither of them turned to look at it. If you came to this for stories of women who carried a medical text in one hand and a skinning knife in the other, and who had earned both the hard way, the small button beneath this video keeps such stories coming, and that is the only thing I will ask of you tonight. They walked a while before he spoke. "That tube," Reese said. "Harlan know you can use it?" "Harlan thinks I'm a woman who's handy with a poultice and good with the children because they're not afraid of me. He lets me do more than he'd admit at the lodge meeting, because I'm cheaper than sending to San Antonio and I don't talk." She watched the road. "He doesn't know about the curtain. He doesn't know about the lodge. He knows what the town knows, which is the Comanche part, because that came off the freight with me. A woman doesn't live where I lived for as long as I lived there and come back looking like she stepped out of a parlor." "The town's got the Comanche part wrong," Reese said. It was not a question, and she did not pretend it was. She had known, since the day by the livery, that this man had read the truer thing under the thing the town had decided. The town's story was the captivity narrative story, the one they printed in the dreadful little pamphlets back east. The white woman dragged, screaming, degraded, broken, a thing to be pitied if she was lucky and shunned if she was not. It was a story that required her to have been only a victim, because a victim could be pitied from a safe distance and did not have to be reckoned with as a person who had lived a life and learned things in it. "They have it wrong the way people always have it wrong," she said. "They think it was all one thing. It wasn't. The first winter, I'd have died of my own grief if a woman named, I'll call her what they let me call her, which was grandmother, though she was not old, if grandmother hadn't decided I was worth the trouble of keeping alive. She'd lost daughters, the army and the cholera between them. I was a poor substitute, and we both knew it, and she kept me anyway. And somewhere in the second year, she stopped keeping me because I was useful, and started keeping me because I was hers. And I stopped staying because I had to, and started staying because—" She broke off. "It was not all one thing, Mr. Reese. That's what the town can't have. They need it to be one thing." "And the medicine?" "She was the one they brought the sick to. burns, birthings, the bloody flux. The throat sickness when the traders brought it up from the south. I'd had 1 year of the college. I knew the names of things she had no names for, and she knew the doing of things the college only lectured about. We taught each other. She watched me set a bone the college way, and grunted and showed me a better way. And she was right, and I never told the men back at Arch Street that the best surgeon I ever stood next to was a Squaw-Woman in a lodge who could not read. Naomi's voice was very level. When the cavalry finally took the camp, in the cold of 75, she put my old dress on me that she'd kept folded all those years, and she cut my hair short the way a captive's was cut, so the soldiers would see what I'd been and bring me in gentle. And she told me to forget the language, so it would go easier for me among my own kind. I've half forgotten it. I make myself forget it. It comes back at night. She stopped walking for a moment. She was killed that winter, not in the taking, after, in the cold, on the walk to the reservation. I wasn't there. That is the part I'd take a knife to my own memory to be rid of, that I wasn't there, that they put me on a wagon to Fort Concho and put her on her feet in the snow, because I had the right colour skin to ride and she did not. Reese said nothing for a while. The lime sack creaked on his shoulder. Fort Concho, he said at last. Cold of 75. You were there. 4th Cavalry was there. He looked off down the road. I scouted that campaign, the river camps, the canyon, Palo Duro. A muscle moved in his jaw. We shot the horses. You know about the horses. She knew about the horses. The thing the town did not discuss about Eli Reese, the reason a man quits the only work he is good at and goes to break horses for the bar cross and will not say why. She had wondered, and now she did not have to wonder. At Palo Duro Canyon, in the autumn of 1874, the 4th Cavalry had taken the great horse herd of the Southern Plains bands, more than 1,000 head, and had cut out a few for the scouts and the officers, and had then driven the rest, the better part of 1,000 and more, into a draw and shot them, all of them, over the better part of a day, because a Comanche on foot was a Comanche who would come into the agency, and a Comanche horsed was a Comanche who was free, and the surest way to end the freedom was to end the horses. She had heard the men of the band speak of it in the lodges after, in a tone she had no word for in either language, a grief that had no bottom. And here beside her on the road to the Hendry place was a man who had stood in that draw with a carbine, and had been, perhaps, one of the hands that did it, and who had quit the cavalry after, and who broke horses now, one at a time, gentling them, never selling one to a man he didn't trust, as if a man could put back into the world, one animal at a time, a thing he had helped take out of it, 1,000 at a time in a single day. I quit in 75, Reese said. I didn't have a reason I could say to the Major. I have one now I still can't say. So I don't. He shifted the sack. I looked at your hands that first day and I thought, that woman was where I was, the other side of it, and I figured the least a man could do, having been on the side I was on, was not be one more person in this town with something to say about her hands. They had reached the Hendry gate. Naomi stood with her hand on the latch and did not lift it yet. I have not told that to a living soul on this side of the line, she said. No, Reese said. Me neither. And that was the whole of the romance of it, if a person insists on the word. Two people who had each carried, alone, the opposite end of the same unbearable thing, standing at a gate in the dusk, having set the ends down, for one moment, side by side. He did not touch her. She did not weep. The Victorian arrangement of the thing would have had him take her hand and her colour rise. The truth of it, which I have pieced together from the daybook, and from one letter, and from what an old woman in Sutter's Wells told a county historian in 1931, is that they stood a moment, and then she lifted the latch and went in to look in the throats of the Hendry children, and he waited in the yard with the lime, and that was more, between those two, than a year of held hands would have been between people who had less to set down. 2 of the 4 Hendry children had it. By the end of that week, Sutter's Wells had 11 cases under 12 years of age in 6 houses, and the disease had done what Naomi had told Cora Pruitt it would do, which was travel like fire in a town built of touching houses and shared wells and one schoolroom where, before she had got the school closed, over the protests of 3 fathers who said a little throat soreness never killed anybody, 40 children had sat breathing on one another for 2 days after the Pruitt boy first went hoarse. Dr. Harlan came back from the Kessler place on the 3rd day. He came back to find his examining chair occupied by a child with a silver tube in its throat and his quicklime gone, and a woman he had hired to be handy with poultices running a quarantine across his town with the authority of a field surgeon. And to his great credit, and I want to be fair to Harlan, who was a tired man at the wrong end of a long career in a place that had worn him down, he stood in his own doorway and looked at what she had done and said only, "Show me the feather trick," and learned it, and went to work beside her. He was 63. He had a bad heart himself, the same complaint he had ridden 14 miles to tend in the Kessler grandfather, and on the 9th day of the sickness, having been up the better part of 4 nights, he sat down on the step of the Hendry porch to rest a moment between houses, and did not get up. Naomi was 3 houses away, opening a child's throat for steam, when the Hendry boy came running with his face wrong, and she got to the porch, and Harlan was still breathing, but his lips had the slate colour she knew too well. Only it was not his throat closing, it was the pump in his chest giving out, and there was nothing in her bag or her 2 countries of learning that could open a road to a heart. He looked up at her. He knew. A doctor knows. "You'll have to do the rest of it," he said. His voice was a thread. "There's no one to send for that had come in time. You know that." "I know it." "Then it's yours, the whole of it." His hand found her wrist, and his grip was nothing, a child's grip. "Vance, whatever your right name is, and I always reckoned Vance wasn't it. You're the best I've stood next to in this country, and I've stood next to a few. Don't let the Reverend bury more of these children than you have to." A long pause for breath he could not quite find. "And get them to make it legal, after, so the next town doesn't make you sweep its sidewalk first." He died on the Hendry porch a little before midnight, with the sound of children fighting for breath coming through 2 walls, and Naomi closed his eyes and sat with him for exactly as long as she could afford, which was not long, and then she got up, because 3 houses down a child was clogging, and she was now, by the plain arithmetic of it, the only thing standing between Sutter's Wells and the Reverend Teague's shovel. She had 11 children, and no doctor, and 4 days by her reckoning, until the worst of the cases came to the place where steam stopped buying minutes, and the knife was the only thing. She went back down the dark street. There was a lamp burning in the window of the house she had not let herself look at all week, the house of Cora Pruitt's married sister, Eliza Tate, who had run for the Reverend that first day, and who had, the town said, written to the county seat to ask whether a woman of Naomi Vance's history could be permitted to practice medicine on white children at all. Eliza Tate had 2 of her own under 12. Naomi had checked their throats on the 2nd day, over Eliza's objection, and they had been clear, and Eliza had stood in her doorway with her arms folded across them like a gate. The lamp was burning now at an hour when a frugal frontier house had no business burning oil. Naomi stopped in the road. She was so tired the street tilted. She knew what a lamp at that hour meant. She had 4 days and 11 children, and a dead doctor cooling on a porch, and not 1 hour to spend on the woman who had tried to have her run out of the only place that had let her be of use. And she stood in the road and looked at the yellow window, and she thought of grandmother, who had kept alive a poor substitute for a dead daughter in the first winter, for no reason that profited her at all. And she crossed the dark yard and knocked on Eliza Tate's door. The door came open before her knuckles had left the wood. Fast, the way a door opens when someone has been standing on the other side of it, not daring to knock on her own decision. And Eliza Tate stood in the lamplight, with her younger child in her arms, the 4-year-old, the boy, and the boy was making the sound, the high, tearing flu note that Naomi could now have picked out of any noise on earth. And Eliza Tate's face had nothing left in it of the woman who had folded her arms across her doorway like a gate. It had only the one thing. The paper screen had fallen here too. "I wrote to the county," Eliza said. The words came out of her in a rush, as if she had to get the worst of herself said before she could ask for anything. "I wrote to Austin to say you oughtn't be let touch white children. The letter's gone. I can't call it back. I'd give my right hand to call it back." She held the child out, not setting him down, holding him out the way you hold out a thing you are surrendering. "He started in the night. I waited because of the letter, because of what I'd said. I waited near 3 hours to be ashamed in front of you, and now look what my shame's done to him. Look at his lips." "Bring him in. Lay him on the table. Lamp closer." Naomi was already moving, already rolling back her cuffs, and the tiredness had dropped off her the way it always did when there was a throat to look into, and she would feel it again later, all of it at once. But not now. "Eliza, listen to me. The letter doesn't matter tonight. Nothing you wrote matters tonight. There's just him and the grey skin and how much road is left in his throat, and we are going to find out which, together, you and me, and you are going to do exactly what I say, and we are not going to talk about the letter. Open his mouth for me. Good. Hold the lamp steady. Steady." The road was nearly closed. She had perhaps minutes, not the comfortable margin she'd had with the Pruitt boy. She set Eliza to the kettle and the tent of sheet, but the steam was a kindness already too late for, and she knew it within the first breath, and she did the thing she had learned to do, which was to decide fast, and not let the deciding show on her face. There was no Reese this time to hold the head. There was only the mother, who an hour ago had been ashamed to knock, and who would now have to hold her own child still under the knife, or the child would die for the want of a second pair of trained hands. And Naomi looked at Eliza Tate across the lamp-lit table and made the hardest call of the trade, which is to ask a terrified parent to be the assistant. "Eliza, he cannot get air. I have to make a way for it, low here, with a blade and a tube, the same as I did for your sister's Tom, who is sitting up taking broth tonight, 3 houses from here. You've heard. The whole town's heard. I have done this, and it works, and I need you to hold his head exactly where I put it, and not move it, though everything in you screams to snatch him up. Can you do that? Don't tell me what you feel. Tell me yes or no, because if it's no, I need to know now so I can hold him with my knees and lose the steadiness I'd rather spend on the cut." "Yes," Eliza Tate said. "Yes. God forgive me, yes, tell me where." And so the woman who had tried to have Naomi barred from the practice of medicine held her own son's head in the cradle of her 2 hands, while the Squaw-Woman opened his throat by lamplight, and the cut was clean, and the tube went in, and the boy who had been turning the colour of slate pulled a whistling breath through the silver, and then another. And Eliza Tate put her face down against her child's wet hair and made no sound at all, and Naomi sat back on the kitchen stool and let her own hands shake now that it was over, where the mother could not see them, because there is a time to let them shake, and it is afterward, always afterward. I have thought a great deal about that night, the night of the second cut, because it is the hinge of the whole story, and because it is the part the town later told least accurately. They told it as Naomi Vance's triumph over the woman who'd wronged her. But there is a letter, the one letter in her hand that survives, written years after to a person I will come to, and in it she says of that night only this: "I did not save the Tate boy to win anything. I have never in my life cut a throat to win. I did it because grandmother kept a useless grieving girl alive in a hard winter for no profit to herself, and a debt like that you do not pay back to the one who lent it, because she is dead in the snow where they walked her. You pay it forward to whoever is in front of you, even the ones who'd have run you out, especially those." That is the whole of what she taught me, and it is worth more than the year at the college, which taught me how, but not why. The letter is undated. She rarely dated letters. The habit, she wrote once, of a person who had spent 6 years where the calendar did not run. She signed it Naomi Vance, or no, I should be exact, because the exactness is the whole of the legal history of her. She signed it Vance, the maid name, but the college record under its seal calls her Caro, and the courthouse entry, in the clerk's careless hand, has it both ways in the space of 3 lines, and she let it stand both ways, which I think was deliberate. The sickness burned through Sutter's Wells for 19 days in all. Naomi Vance lost 2 children of the 11, and I will not pretend otherwise, because she did not pretend it, and the daybook names them. A Hendry girl who was too far gone before the school closed, and the Mott infant who was always going to be the one the disease took, being not yet 2, and there is nothing a knife can do for a throat that small. 2 of 11. In the epidemics that crossed that country in those years, before the antitoxin, a town could lose half its sick children and call it the will of God and not be thought to have done badly. 2 of 11 was a number that, when the contract surgeon finally came up from San Antonio on the 21st day, made him take off his hat in the road to a woman in a grey dress and ask her, as one professional to another, what she had used for the disinfection, and write the answer down. She told him quicklime and carbolic, and a quarantine she'd had to fight 3 fathers to get, and steam, and the tube when the steam stopped serving. She did not tell him about grandmother. She told that to one man only, ever, and he already knew. Dr. Harlan was buried on the 11th day, in the middle of it, fast, the way you bury in an epidemic, and the Reverend Teague read over him. Naomi could not come. She was at the Mott house, losing the infant, which is a thing I think she would have traded the whole town's good opinion to have come out the other way. But the Reverend Teague, standing over the grave of the old doctor, said a thing that the town remembered, because it was not the kind of thing the Reverend Teague was known for saying. He said that he had stood at a great many gravesides in Sutter's Wells, and that he had come, over the years, to believe that the curing was a kind of vanity, and the burying the truer work, and that he had been, on this point, for many years, a fool. He did not say her name. He did not have to. Everyone standing in that little graveyard in the wind knew whose hands had emptied the churchyard of the rows of small graves it had been preparing to fill. The legal part came after, the way the dead doctor had told her to make it come. It was Cora Pruitt who started it, and Eliza Tate who, of all people, carried it, the 2 sisters going house to house with a paper, because a paper signed by the citizens of a town carried weight at the county seat that a paper from one frightened woman writing in the night did not. The paper asked the authorities to recognize Mrs. Naomi Vance as the lawful practitioner of medicine in Sutter's Wells, the office being vacant by the death of Dr. Harlan, and it noted, in Eliza Tate's careful hand, that the said Mrs. Vance had in the recent epidemic, by methods the visiting surgeon from San Antonio had examined and approved, preserved the lives of 9 children of 11 taken sick, including, the paper said, and this was Eliza's wording, and she would not be talked out of it, 2 of the signer's own, The letter Eliza had sent to Austin in the night had asked whether such a woman could be permitted to practice on white children at all. The paper she carried now asked the opposite and was signed by 41 people, and 3 of the men who signed it were the 3 fathers who had fought the school closing. And when a thing like that happens in a town, it does not happen because the town has grown noble. It happens because the town has been somewhere it cannot go back from, and is trying, clumsily, with a paper, to say so. There remained the matter of the qualification because the state would not license on gratitude. And here is where the year behind the curtain in Philadelphia came back, after 11 years, to be of use. Naomi Vance wrote and signed it Naomi Vance, the name she had made, not the name she was born to, which by then she had decided would stay on the cord under her collar with the ring, to the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania to ask whether the record of her year of study survived. It did. They kept careful records of the women they had taught behind the curtain, perhaps because they suspected the world would one day require the proof. The college sent back a letter under its seal, attesting that one Naomi Caro had been enrolled and in good standing through the session of 1868, and the contract surgeon from San Antonio wrote a second letter attesting to what he had seen with his own eyes, and between the dead institution's careful paper and the living surgeon's plain witness and 41 signatures from a town that had learned the hard way, the county recognized her. It is the only case I have found, in the records of that county, of a woman licensed to practice on the strength of 1 year's schooling, and an epidemic survived. The clerk who entered it wrote her name and then, not knowing what else to put for the qualification, wrote, "Experience and the testimony of the town." I have stood at the courthouse and read it. The ink has held. The town is gone. Sutter's Wells dried up when the railroad went elsewhere in the 90s, and there is nothing there now but a windbreak of dead cottonwoods, and the courthouse records moved to the county seat. But the ink has held. Eli Reese was at the recognition. He stood at the back of the room, by the door, with his hat in his hands, and when it was done and the clerk had blotted the entry and the few people had filed out, he came up the aisle to where she stood, and he did a thing he had not done in the 11 months she had known him, which was to take off his hat to her, properly, the way a man takes off his hat to a lady in a parlor in the East, a thing she had not had done to her since before the curtain, since before the freight wagon, since before the lodge. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "You never call me that. You never call me anything." "I'm calling you it now, on purpose." He turned the hat in his hands. "There's a thing I've been a long time getting to. I broke a colt for the Tate place last spring, and Eliza Tate told her sister she'd not have a man in her barn who consorted with, well, you know the word. And I kept on breaking her colt anyway because she didn't pay well enough to make it worth a man's pride, and because I'd already decided whose side of this town I was on, which was yours, before I had any right to a side." He stopped. "I'm 41. I've got a quarter section on the concho and 40 head and a soul that owes more than it can pay. I'd not insult you by pretending I'm offering you a step up. I'm offering you a man who knows the worst of where you've been because he stood on the wrong end of it, and who'd count it the work of the rest of his life to be on the right end of things beside you. That's the whole of the offer. You can take your time." Naomi Vance looked at him for a long moment in the empty courthouse. Then she reached up to her collar and drew out the cord, and on it the small gold ring, and she held it in her open hand where he could see it. "This was my mother's," she said. "Not a husband's. I never had a husband on this side of the line, whatever the town decided. Grandmother kept it folded in my old dress all 6 years and gave it back to me with the dress when the soldiers came, and it is the one thing I carried out of 2